Tasha Green sat in her car on the side of the road watching the red and blue lights flash in the rearview mirror, her heart racing in her chest. She had been rushing all morning trying to make it to a job interview at a local nonprofit organization. The last thing she needed was another setback, another delay. She had been dealing with too much already, trying to juggle the remnants of her military career, the struggles of civilian life, and the endless demands that seemed to come from every direction. Tasha was a woman with a past that shaped every decision she made, but the challenges she faced now felt overwhelming. The police officer approached her car, slowly tapping his flashlight against his palm, his expression unreadable. Tasha took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't in the mood for an argument. She had already fought too many battles in her life, but she also knew that sometimes life was just unfair, and this seemed like one of those moments. "Mom, do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his voice flat and authoritative. Tasha glanced at the expired registration sticker on her windshield and immediately felt a wave of frustration crash over her. She knew what this was about, but that wasn't the whole story. She had been trying to get to the DMV for weeks, but the lines were long and the appointments were always booked. By the time she could find a moment to take care of it, life would pull her in another direction. "I've been meaning to get to the DMV," she said, her voice tight, but trying to sound reasonable. "I've just had a lot going on lately." The officer didn't seem to care. His eyes remained cold and unmoving, as if her words didn't matter at all. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to give you a citation for the expired registration," he said, his tone matter of fact. Tasha's heart sank, the weight of the ticket heavier than she had expected. This wasn't just a simple fine. This was yet another reminder that life was never easy for someone like her. As a black woman and a veteran, there was always an extra layer of struggle that others didn't have to face. It wasn't just about the ticket. It was about everything the world seemed to throw at her, no matter how hard she tried to stay afloat. "Look, I'm really late for an important interview," Tasha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can you just let me off with a warning this time, please?" The officer hesitated for a moment, but only for a second before he shook his head no. "Sorry, ma'am, but I can't do that. You'll have to take it up with the court," he said coldly, stepping back to write up the citation. Tasha sat there fuming, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had never been one to back down, but today felt different. Today felt like the universe was telling her that nothing would ever be easy, nothing would be handed to her, and no matter how hard she fought, she would always be up against something bigger than herself. When the officer finally handed her the citation, Tasha took it without a word. She was too angry to speak, too tired to argue. She just wanted to get out of there and move on with her day. But as she pulled away from the curb, her frustration only deepened. She couldn't shake the feeling that this ticket wasn't just about a registration sticker. It was about everything she had ever faced and everything she would continue to fight against. Tasha sat in a crowded courtroom, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the bench as she waited for her case to be called. The room buzzed with the low murmur of voices, but Tasha felt isolated, like a single drop of water in an ocean of faces. She had never been one to shy away from conflict, but today she was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of explaining herself, and tired of feeling invisible. The ticket had been a small thing, a trivial moment in the grand scheme of her life, yet it felt like a reflection of all the struggles she faced. A traffic violation seemed so insignificant, yet here she was in a courtroom, preparing for yet another battle she didn't deserve. As the judge's gavel slammed down, the room fell silent. Judge Michael Stevens, a man whose reputation for strictness preceded him, looked over the room with sharp, calculating eyes. His gaze flicked over Tasha as she rose to stand before him, his expression neutral, unreadable. He had seen countless cases like hers. People late on bills, people forgetting to register their cars, people making mistakes that cost them in small ways. But to Tasha, it wasn't small. It was the latest in a long string of challenges she had never been able to escape. "State your name and the nature of your case," Judge Stevens said, his voice deep and authoritative. "Tasha Green," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety building her chest. "I'm here for a traffic violation, expired registration." The judge nodded and glanced down at the papers in front of him. Tasha could feel his eyes scanning her, sizing her up, as if deciding what kind of person she was. It wasn't just about the ticket, it was about who she was, what she looked like, and what he thought of her. She had seen it all before: the judgment, the assumptions, the way people underestimated her before they even knew her. It wasn't new. It never would be. "Ms. Green," Judge Stevens began, his voice curt. "You've been issued a citation for an expired registration. I trust you understand the importance of keeping your vehicle properly registered." "Yes, Your Honor," Tasha replied, holding her ground. "I understand, but I've been dealing with a lot, and I just haven't been able to get to the DMV. It's been difficult." The judge didn't look up from his papers. "I understand that life can be challenging, but responsibility is key. You have to take care of the basics. A car registration isn't something to overlook." Tasha's frustration boiled over, but she held herself in check. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to fight. But the words stung. The way he dismissed her. The way he saw her as just another person who had failed to meet expectations. She was used to this, being dismissed, being misunderstood, but it never got easier. "Your Honor, I served in the military for years," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I've fought in combat zones. I've led troops. I'm not someone who takes responsibility lightly. But sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan, and it's hard to keep up with everything." There was a brief pause. The room felt like it held its breath. Tasha looked at the judge, hoping for some recognition, some sign that he understood the weight of her words. But Judge Stevens didn't flinch. He didn't look at her like she was anything special. He didn't soften. He didn't acknowledge the truth behind her statement. "Life's challenges are not an excuse, Ms. Green," Judge Stevens said firmly. "You're being fined for your oversight, and that's the decision." Tasha's heart sank. She had hoped for a moment of empathy, but instead, she was met with a coldness that cut deep. The judge raised his gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. Tasha took the fine and left the courtroom, her chest tight with the weight of it all. She had hoped that today would be different, but it wasn't. It never was. It was just another reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she gave, the world was quick to remind her of what she didn't have. As Tasha walked out of the courthouse, her mind raced, replaying the entire experience over and over. The echo of the judge's voice, the dismissive tone, the fine she could hardly afford, it all weighed heavily on her chest. She had faced battles that most couldn't even imagine, yet here she was, sitting in a courtroom, treated like just another irresponsible citizen. It felt like a slap in the face, the sting of being judged not for who she was or what she had done, but for a moment of imperfection. She clenched her fists as she walked down the steps of the courthouse, the heat of her frustration rising in her throat. Tasha had never been someone who let setbacks keep her down, but today was different. She had worked so hard to get to this point in her life, and it felt like everything was constantly slipping through her fingers. She thought of her time in the military, the years spent in foreign lands, fighting for something bigger than herself. She had seen the worst of humanity, felt the weight of responsibility that came with leading others into battle, and yet none of that seemed to matter in this small, unimportant courtroom. Her thoughts drifted back to the day she enlisted, a moment when she thought joining the army would be the key to escaping the harsh realities of her neighborhood. She had been raised in a world where violence, poverty, and despair were everyday companions. But when she put on that uniform, everything changed. The military gave her purpose, structure, and a sense of belonging. She rose through the ranks, serving in some of the most dangerous conflict zones, earning medals for bravery and leadership. She had seen things that haunted her in ways words couldn't express, but she had always carried on. The medals on her chest were symbols of sacrifice, courage, and unwavering commitment. But out here, in the civilian world, those same honors meant nothing. It felt like no one understood the toll it had taken on her. She had returned home from her last tour, hoping to rebuild her life, but civilian life had proved to be just as difficult, if not more so. The transition was harder than she had ever imagined. There were no drills to follow, no clear structure to guide her. Everything was unpredictable. The world expected her to adjust, to simply pick up where she left off, but the scars from her service, both seen and unseen, didn't fade that easily. She had suffered from PTSD, a constant reminder of the lives lost and the missions she had completed under immense pressure. She tried to keep it together, to find work, to take care of herself, but it was like wading through quicksand. Each step forward felt like two steps back. The people she met after returning home rarely understood her struggles. They didn't see the fear she carried, the nights she spent awake, replaying the sounds and images of war in her mind. Instead, they saw a woman trying to find her place in a world that didn't seem to care. When she applied for jobs, she often felt like her military experience wasn't seen as an asset, but as a liability. Employers didn't understand what it was like to lead a team in combat, to make decisions that could mean life or death. They didn't understand the kind of strength it took to keep going when everything inside you screamed to stop. And now here she was, in a courtroom, paying for an expired registration, something so trivial in the grand scheme of her life, yet somehow it felt like another battle she had lost. Tasha felt the weight of it all pressed down on her as she walked out onto the street. She was tired of fighting, tired of explaining herself, tired of feeling like her best wasn't good enough. But deep down, a small spark of resilience still burned. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Tasha walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the weight of the fine and the judge's words still pressing heavily on her chest. She had hoped for some understanding, some recognition of the life she had lived, but all she had received was a reminder of how the world often overlooked her. The hot sun beat down on her, but she didn't feel its warmth. She felt cold, numb, like she was moving through life with one foot in the past and the other in a future that seemed uncertain and far out of reach. Her mind wandered, and for a moment, she thought about just driving away, going somewhere, anywhere, to escape the frustration that gnawed at her. But then she heard a voice, soft and calm, cutting through her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss, are you okay?" Tasha turned to find a woman standing beside her, a friendly smile on her face. She was dressed in a smart blouse and slacks, her professional appearance in sharp contrast to Tasha's worn-out clothes and the exhaustion in her eyes. The woman's expression was kind, but there was something else in her eyes, a sense of recognition, as if she had seen the weight Tasha carried. Tasha paused, unsure whether she wanted to talk. The last thing she wanted was to explain herself to a stranger, to tell yet another person about her struggles. But something about the woman's presence made Tasha hesitate. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, but there was a quiet understanding in the woman's gaze, a warmth that made Tasha feel like maybe, just maybe, this moment could be different. "I'm fine," Tasha said, her voice flat, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Just dealing with some stuff." The woman nodded, unfazed by the brief answer. "I can see that. I'm Sharon, by the way. I couldn't help but notice your military insignia. Are you a veteran?" Tasha's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the recognition. Most people didn't notice, didn't care. But this woman, Sharon, had seen it immediately. Tasha hesitated, unsure of whether she should reveal her past, but there was something comforting about Sharon's demeanor. Something that told Tasha it was okay to talk, even if just for a moment. "I served," Tasha said simply. "Army. A few years ago. Been home for a while now." Sharon's expression softened. "Thank you for your service. I'm a veteran too, Navy. I know how hard it can be to transition back into civilian life. The world doesn't always make it easy." Tasha nodded, the words hitting her like a wave. She had heard it before, the well-meaning comments about how hard it was for veterans, but there was something different about hearing them from someone who had lived it too. Someone who understood without needing to ask all the questions. Sharon glanced down at the citation in Tasha's hand and frowned. "A ticket? That's tough. I'm sorry you're going through that. Life's hard enough without the added stress of things like this." Tasha let out a sigh, the anger that had been simmering inside her now deflating like a balloon. She didn't want to talk about the ticket. She didn't want to get into the details of her life, the things she had lost, the battles she had fought. But Sharon's kindness, her understanding, made something inside Tasha shift. For the first time that day, she felt seen, not just as the woman with the ticket, but as someone who had a story, someone who mattered. I just feel like everything's falling apart, Tasha admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I've been trying so hard to find my way, to get back on my feet, but every time I take a step forward, something pulls me back. It's like I can't win. Sharon smiled gently, placing a hand on Tasha's shoulder. I get it, I really do. But let me tell you something. I work with a nonprofit that helps veterans transition back into civilian life. We help with everything. Job placement, legal issues, you name it. I think you'd be a great fit. If you're interested, I can help connect you with some resources. There's always a way out, Tasha. You don't have to do this alone. Tasha looked up at Sharon, a mixture of surprise and hope filling her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had offered to help without judgment, without expecting anything in return. For a moment, she almost believed that maybe, just maybe, things could start to turn around. I'd like that, Tasha said, her voice quieter now, but filled with a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. I'd really like that. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. Tasha's mind was still reeling from the encounter with Sharon outside the courthouse. She had barely expected to get any sympathy, let alone an offer of help from someone who truly understood her struggles. It was as if a door had opened, a door she hadn't even known was there. And with that door came a sense of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Sharon had wasted no time in getting to work. The very next day, Tasha received a call from a veterans advocacy group, the organization Sharon had mentioned. They introduced themselves as a network designed to help veterans like Tasha navigate the complexities of civilian life, from job placements to legal aid. The voice on the other end of the line was warm and welcoming, far different from the cold bureaucracy Tasha was accustomed to. They listened to her story without rushing, patiently gathering the details of her background, her experiences, and her challenges. Tasha found herself opening up, speaking of the isolation she often felt, the struggles with post-traumatic stress, and the difficulties of finding a place where she truly belonged. You're not alone in this, the voice said, offering reassurance. We've helped people like you before, and we can help you too. There are resources available, and there are people who understand what you've been through. Don't give up. It was the first time in a long while that Tasha felt like someone actually cared. Someone saw her for more than just the mistakes she had made or the things she hadn't accomplished. It was hard to believe, but for the first time in a while, Tasha allowed herself to feel a little hope. Within a week, Tasha was invited to a meeting with Sharon and the rest of the nonprofit team. The office was cozy but professional, with walls covered in posters celebrating the achievements of veterans who had found new purpose after their service. As she entered the space, she was greeted by several people who all seemed genuinely interested in her story. There was a man named Joe, a former Marine who worked as a job placement specialist. He shook her hand firmly, his eyes full of understanding, as if he could see the weight she carried. There was also Maya, a legal advisor who specialized in helping veterans with court issues and who was quick to reassure Tasha that her ticket wasn't the end of the world. We're not just here to help you with a job or a fine, Sharon said it as she introduced the team. We're here to help you rebuild your life, Tasha. It's not about what you've done wrong. It's about what you can do moving forward. Tasha was speechless, overwhelmed by their warmth and the support they were offering. She had walked in thinking she might get some help with job prospects, maybe a little advice on dealing with her ticket, but what she was receiving was something far more valuable. A second chance. The team quickly got to work, pulling together resources that could help her. They scheduled her for interviews with potential employers who understood the unique challenges veterans faced. Maya took a look at her legal situation and assured her that the fine she had been issued wasn't insurmountable, that they could work with the court to have it reduced or even dismissed. They even helped her connect with a therapist who specialized in PTSD to help her address the emotional scars she carried from her military service. As Tasha listened to all the things they could do for her, something shifted inside her. She had spent so much time trying to do everything alone, trying to handle it all by herself, but now, for the first time, she realized that it wasn't a weakness to ask for help. It wasn't a failure. It was strength. By the time Tasha left the meeting, she felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't just another statistic anymore. She was a person, a veteran who had done incredible things and who still had so much to give. She walked out of the office with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to take the next steps toward rebuilding her life. She had no idea what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it head-on. Weeks passed, and Tasha's life slowly began to shift in ways she hadn't imagined possible. The days still felt long, and there were moments when the weight of her past and her struggles threatened to pull her down again. But for the first time in a long time, she could see a light at the end of the tunnel. She had been working with the nonprofit, and each day brought new opportunities, new challenges, and a growing sense of possibility. She was no longer just drifting through life. She was actively rebuilding it, piece by piece. Her first breakthrough came when she was offered an interview at a local veteran-friendly organization. The position was for a program coordinator, a role that required leadership skills, organization, and the ability to manage multiple projects at once. It was the kind of job she had wanted since leaving the military, something that would give her purpose, a sense of belonging, and a chance to make a real difference. She had been nervous walking into the interview, but as she sat across from the hiring manager, she found herself speaking with confidence, sharing the lessons she had learned as a leader in the Army, and discussing how those experiences had shaped her ability to manage teams, handle high-pressure situations, and stay focused on a mission. The manager was clearly impressed. He asked her about her time in the military, about the obstacles she had overcome, and about her commitment to helping others. The questions were all too familiar, but this time, Tasha felt a sense of pride in her answers. She wasn't just a veteran struggling to adapt to civilian life. She was a woman who had faced some of the toughest challenges anyone could imagine and had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever. "I think you'd be a great fit for this role," the manager said as the interview came to a close. "You bring exactly what we need: experience, leadership, and a real passion for helping others. We'd love to have you on our team." Tasha's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and excitement. It was happening. She had done it. She had fought through the doubts, the obstacles, and the moments of despair, and now she had a chance to prove herself again, not just to the world, but to herself. She thanked the manager and left the interview with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a product of her circumstances anymore. She was creating her future one step at a time. But it wasn't just the job offer that was turning her life around. The support from the nonprofit continued to guide her in ways she hadn't expected. Maya, the legal advisor, had helped her navigate the court system, and as promised, the judge had reduced the fine for her expired registration. What had seemed like a monumental setback now felt like a distant memory. She'd also began therapy, something she had been hesitant to try. But after just a few sessions, Tasha started to realize how much her past had shaped her present. The trauma she had carried from her time in combat wasn't something she could simply leave behind. It was a part of who she was, and it deserved to be addressed. Each session left her feeling lighter, as if the emotional weight she had been carrying for years was slowly starting to lift. She was learning how to cope, how to process the things she had buried deep inside for so long. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Tasha was still a work in progress, she knew that, but she had stopped believing that progress was impossible. She had stopped believing that she was doomed to be defined by her past mistakes, her struggles, or the things she couldn't change. With every new day, she felt stronger, more capable, and more confident in her ability to shape her future. And that, more than anything, was the change she had needed all along. As the weeks went on, Tasha began to find her rhythm in her new life. The job she had landed with the veteran-friendly organization was everything she had hoped for and more. She was surrounded by people who understood her, who respected the strength it took to come back from the things they had all faced. The work was demanding but fulfilling, and for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt like she had a purpose that went beyond just surviving day to day. She thrived in the role. She managed projects, led meetings, and coordinated events designed to help other veterans transition to civilian life. It was a job that drew on every skill she had honed during her time in the military: problem solving, leadership, and the ability to inspire those around her. There were moments of exhaustion, moments when the weight of her past seemed too heavy to carry. But when she walked into that office, surrounded by people who shared her mission, those feelings faded. She was no longer just a veteran struggling to find her place. She was a leader, a mentor, and a guide for others who were going through the same journey she had walked. Her colleagues were supportive, and many had their own stories of struggle and triumph. They were the kinds of people who didn't need explanations. They simply understood. Tasha had forged friendships there, bonds with people who had been through the worst and had come out on the other side stronger. In those relationships, she found a sense of belonging that had always eluded her in the civilian world. But the journey was far from over. While her career was on track, there were still the quiet, lingering moments of self-doubt, the shadows from her past that seemed to rise at unexpected times. The nights when the memories of war would resurface, when the anxiety and the weight of it all threatened to pull her back into the darkness. She had made incredible progress, but healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others. It was on one of those tougher days that Tasha received an unexpected invitation. It was from the same nonprofit that had supported her. This time, it was an invitation to speak at one of their veteran outreach events. The event was being held at a community center, and they wanted Tasha to share her story. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking had never been her thing. She was used to leading from behind the scenes, managing logistics, coordinating teams. But speaking about her own journey, that was a different kind of challenge. The thought of standing before a crowd, exposing herself and her vulnerability, made her stomach twist in knots. But she knew she couldn't shy away from this. She had come too far. So after much deliberation, she agreed. The event was 2 weeks away, and Tasha poured herself into preparing. She wrote out her speech, though each word seemed to force her to relive the hardships she had faced. But as she wrote, she also began to see the strength in her story. She had fought battles that many would never understand, and now she had the opportunity to show others that they too could rise, no matter how impossible their circumstances seemed. The night of the event, Tasha walked onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights were bright and the crowd was a blur, but she could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She took a deep breath, remembering all the times she had stood in front of a unit, leading with authority. This was no different. Only this time, the mission was her own story. She began speaking, her voice steady but full of emotion. She talked about the struggles of returning home, the challenges of finding a place in a world that didn't seem to understand. She spoke about her time in the military, the leadership, the lessons, and the scars she carried. She spoke about how she had stumbled, how she had been knocked down, and how, in the end, she had found the strength to rise again. The words came easily now, not rehearsed but raw and real. She wasn't just telling a story, she was giving a piece of herself to everyone in that room. When she finished, the silence that followed was thick. And then, slowly, the applause started. It grew louder, stronger. Tasha stood there, overwhelmed by the response. It wasn't just applause for her. It was for everyone who had fought, who had struggled, and who had managed to find their way through the darkness. In that moment, she realized something profound. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The applause echoed in Tasha's ears as she stood on that stage, her heart pounding in her chest. The rush of emotion was overwhelming. Relief, pride, but most of all, gratitude. She had spent so many years feeling like an outsider, like her experiences were too heavy, too complicated for anyone to truly understand. But tonight, in front of that audience, she had found something she didn't even know she was searching for: connection. As the applause died down, Tasha stepped off the stage, her legs feeling like they might give way beneath her. She was met by Sharon, Maya, and the rest of the team from the nonprofit. Their faces were lit with smiles, pride, and admiration. Sharon stepped forward first, giving her a brief but firm hug. "You did it, Tasha," Sharon said, her voice full of warmth. "That was incredible. You've inspired so many people tonight. I know you didn't think you could, but you did." Tasha smiled, her eyes welling up. She hadn't expected this kind of reaction. hadn't expected to have such an impact. The emotions were still too raw, and she could feel a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you," Tasha whispered. "I didn't know I could do that. I was so nervous, but I just started talking and it felt right." Maya, who had been standing beside Sharon, placed a hand on Tasha's shoulder. "You spoke from the heart. That's what makes a difference. You shared your journey, your truth, and that's something people need to hear." Tasha nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered around the event. Veterans and their families, civilians, and people who had been touched by her story. They all seemed to be walking away with a new sense of hope. Some came to thank her, to tell her that her words had resonated deeply with them. Others simply offered quiet, knowing nods. It was clear that Tasha had touched more lives than she could have imagined. As she walked back to her car later that evening, she thought about everything she had achieved. The long road to this point had been filled with setbacks, doubts, and challenges. She had struggled with finding her place in the world after returning home from the military, unsure if she was even capable of rebuilding her life. But she had proven herself wrong. She had risen up, found new strength, and used her experiences to help others. The job with the nonprofit was thriving. She had built a network of veterans who now looked to her for guidance, who relied on her wisdom and leadership. The job was more than just a paycheck. It was her calling. Helping others who had gone through similar struggles brought her peace and purpose in a way nothing else could. But even beyond her career, Tasha had found a new sense of self-worth. She no longer saw herself as someone who was defined by her mistakes, her struggles, or the hardships she had faced. She had learned that she was not just the sum of her challenges. She was the strength and resilience she had shown in overcoming them. And with that newfound understanding came confidence, the kind of confidence that wasn't built on perfection, but on acceptance and growth. As Tasha sat in her car, the city lights shining in the distance, she took a deep breath. The journey wasn't over, and there would always be more challenges to face, but for the first time in years, she felt at peace. She had found her way, not through avoiding the hard parts of life, but by embracing them and using them to fuel her growth. And in that moment, she realized that the most important thing wasn't the battles she had fought, the obstacles she had overcome, or even the applause she had received. The most important thing was that she had found her voice, and it was one that could inspire others to find theirs too.